Alright, after the one-tap monk and the one-button ranger, I wanted to try a Witchhunter next. And boy, was I not ready for how insane this turned out to be. I had a ton of plans for builds, but I ended up sticking with an ability I got at level 1. The build is immensely satisfying to play though, as we're basically taking a shotgun to the battlefield that can stun monsters in a single hit, and stacked with the Witchhunter passives will let us delete their HP and give us a chance to explode them, meaning that everything around them will get taken care of as well. The only thing our fragmentation rounds won't work on that well is on bosses, so for those we're gonna be taking high velocity rounds, which we can unlock as soon as we get a level 3 gem. This build isn't all about offense though, because we're also gonna bring enough defense to make us tanky and instantly heal back to full, so that even when we do mess up, our run doesn't necessarily end. But enough talk, let's take a look at how you can make your own version of this build. As with any of my other guides, the goal is to present you with a blueprint so that you know which nodes to aim for and what gear to look out for, without being forced to look for the exact same stats. I will of course link my current setup in the pinned comment if you're more comfortable following a predefined path. For our build, we're gonna rely on 3 active abilities, as well as a single passive one. The first is fragmentation rounds, which will turn our crossbow into a shotgun and is ideal for taking down packs of monsters. While the second is high velocity rounds, which we're gonna mainly use on bosses. Now, in and of themselves, both of these are very clunky to use, but with the right gear and gems, we won't be slowed down by the mercenaries reload mechanic, which a lot of people seem to dislike. The first 2 gems you're gonna want to add to fragmentation rounds won't directly affect your damage. Instead, you'll want to add overpower so that you can stun enemies faster, and auto reload so that you can instantly reload your crossbow as soon as you do stun an enemy. This means that you're gonna have 0 reload time and mana cost, which is gonna be important when we talk about our gear later. Once you can add more slots, you're gonna want Devastate, which is gonna break your enemy's armor every time you land a heavy stun, and Brutality, which is a 35% physical damage boost. Once you can slot in all 4, you're gonna end up with an ability that can clear large packs of monsters that stuns most of them instantly, meaning they can't attack you while also breaking their armor, and you'll automatically reload your crossbow so that you can finish them off if they aren't dead already. As mentioned, this ability isn't great for bosses, so we're gonna add high velocity rounds to our setup, which is a pretty disappointing skill when you use it without support gems. But as soon as you add Scattershot, this turns into an ability that shreds through high health targets. I initially thought that this gem would turn it into more of a shotgun style attack like it does for the Ranger's concoctions, but instead we end up with a 3-round burst that fires mostly in the same direction, so that 20% damage penalty actually turns into a pretty solid damage boost. Since we're mainly gonna be using this on high health targets, we also want to add as much damage as possible, and for that we're gonna be taking Heft for a flat 30% boost, and Deep Cuts as well eventually add some bleeding damage to our build as well. To make both of these even better, we're also gonna pick up Emergency Reload, which will allow us to skip the reload time of whatever ability is currently active, and will greatly help with killing bosses. Although don't forget about this when you do get swarmed by enemies and you need a quick reload of your fragmentation rounds as well. We can then further buff this ability by adding Ingenuity to reduce the cooldown, and Premeditation for another 15% damage boost to whatever bolt we're currently using. As for the Spirit Gems, you're probably gonna want to pick up Herald of Ash initially, which causes enemies you overkill to explode for a percentage of that damage, until you can unlock Overwhelming Presence, which is gonna make enemies easier to stun. This will also let you inflict elemental ailments easier, which won't necessarily help for the build I'm using, but it could open options if you want to experiment with keeping Herald of Ash for example. Normally I would add a second Spirit Gem, but this time I decided to go all in on support gems which also cost Spirit. The first is Clarity, which will help with mana regen. The second is Vitality, which is gonna heal us for 1% HP per second, and then the third is Cannibalism, which is gonna heal us for 4% of our HP whenever we do kill a monster. I also did try out Shard Scavenger, which would consume a fully broken armor to instantly reload our crossbow, but the 9 seconds of internal cooldown doesn't really make it worth using in my opinion. And that's basically it. Fragmentation rounds for packs of monsters, high velocity rounds for high health targets and bosses, and emergency reload whenever you need to quickly fire off a couple more shots. Both of our attacks scale off of physical damage, which might look like the most boring damage type, until you do realize that the amount of bleeding we inflict will be based off our initial hit, and it's also going to impact the amount of HP we can leech. Our biggest damage source will of course be our crossbow, and you're gonna want to pick up a diode crossbow specifically, as these come with the implicit bonus of allowing you to load 2 bolts instead of 1, which will make our build smoother to play and is technically a DPS increase as we do spend less time reloading. Combining this with the auto reload support gem means that we barely need to reload whenever we use fragmentation rounds on packs of enemies. And it's also gonna help us shred through bosses with high velocity rounds, especially if you then add the fact that emergency reload will allow you to shoot off abilities 4 times in a row. When it comes to gearing, you'll know what I'm about to say if you watched either of my previous guides, but we're gonna want to add extra levels to projectile skills once more, as nothing comes even remotely close in terms of damage. This does come with the drawback that our abilities will cost more mana to use though. But a mercenary is fairly unique in that they only use mana when they reload, not whenever they're firing off the crossbow, and all of those auto reloads we've been stacking are free. In terms of modifiers, you're gonna want to prioritize extra physical damage and maybe some attack speed, and socket in 2 iron runes, which will each bump up your physical damage by another 20%. Once you do start unlocking the bleeding nodes, you're gonna want to make sure your crossbow can also inflict bleeding. And the same goes for leeching once you start investing in those. Now, if you're not a solo self-found character, you can actually pick up a crossbow with all of these modifiers for a single exalted orb. And if you do decide to spend more, you can probably find one that's gonna blast through any content. If you ever struggle gearing your character, hit me up in game or on Discord by the way, as we do have a guild bank where members donate their gear they don't need anymore for others to use. Now, our crossbow isn't the only item that can add levels to our projectile skills, because we can get another 2 from our amulet. And to give you an idea just how much of a damage bonus this is, if I remove the amulet and lower my skill level from 19 to 17, we lose about 15% of damage. As for your other gear, you can further add to your damage by having extra physical damage on both your rings and your gloves. You could also try to get more leech on your gloves, but only do this if it isn't at the cost of any of your other defensive stats. And I would also highly recommend movement speed on your boots, which won't necessarily increase your DPS, but is gonna help you greatly avoiding mechanics. Now also make sure you try and cap your elemental resistances and focus on adding armor, evasion or energy shield, or basically any combination of these. I do want to note that Energy Shield is currently somewhat overpowered, especially if you add in Grim Feast, but I figured I would try and see how a combination of armor and evasion would do. And I gotta say, combined with the amount of HP I can leech, I never really struggled to stay alive. The last thing we need to take a look at is our passive and ascendancy skill tree. As for the passives, you're gonna want to focus on boosts to your attack damage and speed, as well as stun buildup, which will act both as an offensive and a defensive layer, and potentially some bleeding if you decide to follow my build exactly. For defense, you want to increase whatever you invested in with your gear, as well as some life leech. Our passive tree is full of these nodes, and at level 71, I haven't even been able to pick up half of the ones I do want to try out. But any that I did pick up, I added based on what I figured I needed the most at that time. A couple of the keystones also look really cool, but I think I might avoid them this time around because their costs don't always seem to outweigh their benefits. Valpax, for example, makes your life leech instant at the cost of being able to use a health flask. But we're already healing so much through life leech that it becoming instant is only a minor benefit, and not being able to use our flask whenever we still have an ailment on us and no enemies to hit might prove a bit too much. I also like the idea of unwavering stance doubling our stun threshold, but again, losing our dodge is a very high cost to pay. And the same goes for Bulwark, which lets us take 30% less damage when dodge rolling, but gives up the possibility to completely avoid damage. I like the idea behind all of these, but as it stands, I don't really think the downsides are worth it. Lastly, we have our Ascendancy, and this one is a bit of an issue. Not so much like our Hexblast Monk, where we only had a couple of traits worth getting. Instead, we kind of want every single one. The ones I'm going with are Zealous Inquisition, which grants us a 10% chance to explode enemies and deal 100% of their HP in damage, which basically means that if you can explode a single enemy, all of the surrounding ones should die too, as most of them have the same HP. And if you're fighting a boss with adds and you can explode multiple of those, you're gonna deal more damage than any other skill can deal. Next, I went with Pitiless Killer, which basically adds a culling strike to our attacks, meaning that if an enemy is on low enough HP, you instantly kill them. And Judge, Jury and Executioner, which deals anywhere from 5 to 30% of a monster's HP on the first strike. So you're effectively lobbing off HP at the start and at the end, and both of these do work on bosses as well, by the way. And that's it. This build will literally let you take a shotgun to the battlefield and bring a backup assault rifle to deal with high HP targets. And since we're using skills that we unlock early on, you'll be able to shred through the campaign, and the build only gets better the more points you can invest. As always, I'm gonna do my best to maintain this build while also trying out every single ascendancy this early access. If you do have any questions, you know where to put them. And if you could hit those like and subscribe buttons, you'd do me a real solid.